Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lorandom discussion, the second in a series on digital curation with the most significant digital curators of the last 30 years. I'm your host, Peter Bauman, the editor in chief of Lorandom, and today I'm incredibly fortunate to be joined by Regina Harsanyi and John Ippolito, two of the most prominent voices in new media curation, but in particular, its preservation, which is what I'll be picking their brains about today. Regina Harsanyi is the Associate Curator of Media Arts at the Museum of the Moving Image and an independent advisor on preventive conservation for variable media arts. Harsanyi is an adjunct assistant professor of film and media studies at Columbia University and a self-proclaimed cheerleader for time-based media. John Ippolito is a new media artist, professor, writer, and former curator at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. He is also professor of new media at the University of Maine, where he founded the Graduate Digital Curation Program, as well as a self-described variable media evangelist. So we have the cheerleader and evangelist for time-based media with us today, and two of the most respected figures in digital media arts preservation. It's very much a privilege to speak to them, and I can't wait, so let's get started. We're here talking about digital preservation, and the first question is just about how collectors think about preservation and whether, in your opinions, they think about it enough, and how you would suggest they go about, from a broader perspective, approaching it.
I guess I'll come right out of the gate and say, maybe controversially, that at least in its current state, time-based media conservation preservation is an anti-capitalist process. Collectors, depending on the type of collector, of course, there are collectors with genuine love of media arts, but there are also collectors, even great collectors, that do think about their finances on top of that and like the value of that work in a financial way. And so I think the last thing on their mind is often how to care for these objects because it is a money pit. There's a term called total cost of ownership or total cost of care. And that essentially means that, okay, so maybe you paid, $5,000 for a work, but that's not actually the cost of the work. The cost of the work is how much it will cost over the lifespan of that collection to take care of it. And so I don't think that most collectors are thinking about this at all. And I also don't necessarily fully blame them for it because they're not taught to think like that. There's plenty more to say probably on the topic, but I'll stop there too if John wants to chime in.
Yeah, 100%. So the analogy I always give is you pick up a cat at the rescue, shelter, and you drop $50 on the cat and you think you're done. And then you go to the vet and you pay $2,000 in vaccine bills. So you're basically have to remember variable media works, by which I mean new media as well as performances and installations and other pieces that are ephemeral and need to be sort of recreated each time, have a sort of debt to the future that you're going to have to pay. And that's part of the value of work. In fact, I once had an intern at the Guggenheim ask me, like, how much is this work worth? And they were thinking of something that you wouldn't imagine could easily be sold, at least back in the 90s. So something like a website or an ephemeral performance. And I thought about it, and I thought, that's a dumb question. And I thought, no, that's a really good question, because it's not just the price that you pay or that's commissioned. It's all the money that would be spent on that work into the future ad infinitum. If you added up all the costs someone was willing to pay, that would be a better value of the work than whatever the selling price was.
I also just want to add to that, that this isn't just a collector issue. This is an industry issue when it comes to just digital assets in general. There was an example recently about the music industry when they moved over to having archival files for the original recordings, they backed them up on external hard drives, but then like, okay, great, you did that work, but then they weren't switching them out every 3 to 5 years. So we still are losing now archival music just because a hard drive wasn't spinning up, because they, again, even at the industry level, not thinking about that total cost. It's just like, oh, that they just think like magically this external hard drive lives forever.
Yeah. So a good example of that from the more, commercial side, again, is MySpace, which was the going, concern for people who were essentially bands and musicians who wanted to post their own music, and they thought because it's in the cloud that therefore it's somehow preserved. And then they did a server migration in, what was it, like, I think it was like 2012, and they lost 50 million songs. But basically all of the songs for a decade starting in like 2003 were just poof, disappeared in a single stroke of the key. I'm realizing more and more as I get older, and of course as I'm sort of a teacher now, that the job of a conservator is equal parts technician and educator, right? You've got to tell collectors, and that means, people in the industry, museums, private collectors, what it means to recreate these works, what sort of responsibility you're going to have when you adopt this pet. The benefit is that you keep alive the most interesting work, at least I think so, of the last, century. But it also means that you've got this additional burden that you didn't expect if you're used to just hanging a painting on a wall in a storeroom.
And something I really wrestle with on this front is that industry level, collector level, sometimes artists as well, there isn't this future-oriented thinking about care. There's this very like present-oriented thinking, I think, in most individuals. And so we have to get people interested in why archiving and preservation and conservation matters. These same people, I think, like these collectors often talk about legacy or generational wealth, etc. Like they'll talk about that, but then they won't actually think about how these assets will exist into the future. And maybe we'll get into it in a little bit, but part of that I think has to do with marketing and miseducation.
I'll just also add on to that, the changing technological landscape has really forced us to address these issues. It used to be back when I started in this game that, there were only a couple of collectors who were interested in, ephemeral, works for the Panza collection, where people would draw things on walls like Sol LeWitt, or they would, create ephemeral performances that we could consider, actually collecting. And those were, I could count the number of collectors interested in that on a single hand. But then the rise of blockchain-based art, in the form of NFTs, and now artificial intelligence-based art has really raised the ante and increased the number of people who are interested perhaps in, accessing work, but now have to also be educated about what preservation means for those systems, largely because in much of the work that I think Regina and I are interested in, it's not just an image that you download. That is not the artwork itself. The work is more dynamic and active. And so when you think about the ways that people have been conditioned by NFTs and by DALL-E and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion to think, well, I just got a picture and that isn't that the artwork, that's an added burden of education that we have to kind of figure out how to convey.
Panza is such an interesting example as well. To give a little bit more context on that, the collector Panza didn't necessarily respect the artist intent in terms of preservation and display of work. And so this is a tale to tell to current digital art collectors. And so when conservators are approaching that collection that entered the Guggenheim, it gets a little confusing because Panza would make changes to the artist's work throughout the lifespan of that collection before it entered the institution. And I see this happening on some level with a lot of these collectors who are buying digital art, where they think that, they can dictate how the work is shown, is preserved. And so on another front of education, it's like teaching more collectors about what the artwork is, like how to preserve it in an ethical way. And yeah, you can learn a lot from Panza on that front. I mean, it's too late in the sense for those works. Also having collectors understand, in a way, the hierarchy. As a curator as well, I see myself as a vessel for showing artists' work, and same as a conservator, instead of being a producer or a director of the artist's work. And so like, I wish collectors would kind of flip where they see themselves in dominance with an artist when they collect work, when they work with the artist directly, and even when they do commissions.
Yeah, fun fact, my first job out of art school was at the Guggenheim, and they gave me the task of working with Donald Judd, one of the most irascible artists of the 20th century, to sort of reconcile him with what Panza had donated to the Guggenheim. And so these are essentially, works where there was a whole correspondence back and forth between Count Panza and Judd about whether Panza was respecting his wishes. So that was a kind of a tough job for someone right out of art school. My colleague got Dan Flavin, who was thrilled with Panza and loved what he did. So it varied an artist by artist, but the Guggenheim's Panza initiative really tried to kind of take that on. And, we're still wrestling with some of these issues now. But as much as we might look back at that period and say, like, oh, that was the Wild West, artists were doing crazy things. And, thank God we've all figured that out. I really don't think we've figured it out. I think those are lessons that we continue to sort of apply to today's technological landscape and the artists who work in it.
You were kind of talking, or you've both been talking about how it's the collector's responsibility. If they own an artist's work, that it's their responsibility to play a role in preserving it. But maybe collectors don't understand why that's important. And maybe we could just talk a little bit more about why exactly it is so important to consider preservation.
I mean, it's a big question. It's like, if you're someone who's going around saying you care about generational wealth, or you care about the legacy of a work, or you gush over an artist and you say you're supporting a true steward or patron of an artist, which so many of these collectors are saying, like, then you have to put in the work. You have to put in the funds and the time and care about things like having documentation and a manual and archival files so that all of that is true. Have collectors talk about donating things in the future to institutions, etc. Like, none of that's possible unless the work is taken care of. It can't just sit, and this goes into a lot of other like fundamental misunderstandings of born digital art, that it's just less vulnerable than a work on paper or canvas or any tangible instantiation. But it's not true. It's more vulnerable. And so I think we're going to keep repeating that it's like it's a miseducation.
Yeah, and I would just say that to me, the audience, again, for these works has changed from a small group of collectors like the Kramliks to a larger group of society, largely, I think, because of kind of technological literacy. These people have grown up playing video games. They know that you click on things in the webs and things happen. And so they're willing to accept that works might have an interactive or participatory or, changing generative nature. Again, particularly with their experience with generative AI, they can see that there are systems at play that can be responsive and adaptive to your needs. And that's part of our zeitgeist, right? That's what these works mean for us, part of what they mean. So in the act of understanding how to preserve them, they're also appreciating that element of those works, the fact that they do need to adapt to future circumstances. And that's both, their Achilles heel, but it's also the sort of reason we're interested in them, right? Kind of a historical example, Alan Capro, often considered the inventor of happenings, which is sort of the performances of the 50s and 60s, had a piece where it was essentially refrigerator magnets, where you have those kind of words that you can combine to make sentences. Only these were like cards of paper. And a collector bought it, and the works, people would come to the house and, kind of rearrange the works on the wall. And then when Capro died, a museum was interested in collecting this work. And the collector said, well, we want it to stay in whatever position it was when we, was last at our house, which is the opposite of what Capro was interested in, right? So, he was all about participation and opening up the artwork. So it became an open work rather than a closed form. So here was a case where it was a very curious decision by a collector to mandate something that obviously, to my mind, reflected a real ignorance of what the artist was all about. Whenever we're in an opportunity working with someone to say, hey, you're going to have to take this into account, it's also an opportunity to say, this is what makes the work interesting, right? Okay, you can download a JPEG of something that was supposed to be mutable on a chain, or you can fix in time in some kind of amber an installation that was supposed to have a performative element. But then in doing so, you're draining the meaning of the work. You're draining what made it exciting and interesting and why this person is in history books and why they had retrospective exhibitions.
But say that it's an artist who wants it preserved in amber. That doesn't even work from a conservation perspective with these types of files. I'll give two examples. There's something called a disk image, where essentially you are able to record all of the data that makes up the computer itself, and so that you can reinstate it. But you can't reinstate it unless you have the correct hardware that matches and can actually like run that disk image, right? So we have actually all these incredible like material concerns around that. And the same thing is true for emulation. Like emulation as a service, like this it's wonderful. It's a really great tool for time-based media conservation, but it needs to be able to run in a hardware environment that can handle that emulation. Like just being able to produce it isn't enough. There are all these other factors that are going to constantly change. And this is actually maybe a little bit of an aside, but it's a current issue in the conservation field because there aren't enough people that are being trained as technicians on the material front to do something like reconstruct the hardware or create the hardware elements that are necessary for the software elements, even if the software is quote unquote preserved in Amber.
So as an example, I'm a huge fan of emulation, did a show of emulation at the Guggenheim, believe that it's the best tool that we have as digital conservators for preserving the future. But it has its limits, as Regina suggests. So a very simple example is the first work that I saw of net art that appeared in the New York Times was a piece by Joseph Squire, an artist who's sort of forgotten now, but he was an early creator of a website that got noticed in 1994. It's called The Place. It was basically a series of enigmatic pictures, and you click through and sort of saw the story. If you go to look at that piece now, which you still can do because it's in the Walker Study Collection. At the time, we all had 640 by 800 monitors, and there was like this big image and then a couple links at the bottom. And now, if you go there, because we all have 8K monitors, it's a tiny postage stamp in the middle of the screen, right? And this image is fixed in its resolution. You're not going to be able to kind of blow it up the way you could, a vector-based image or a flash-based image. So you're kind of stuck with this little postage stamp, even if you emulate perfectly the Netscape, one browser that people looked at it in. So then you have to ask other questions like, well, should we somehow interpolate, and expand the image? Should we only view it on a computer that is, the size of the original resolution, like, some old, Apple computer from the 80s? How do we figure out the best way to translate that so that it's accessible to future viewers? And as Regina knows, I've been working for some time on the idea that we can create questions that then you can ask the artist, particularly museums can ask or private collectors can ask at the time of acquisition, that help navigate these possible future choices. The Variable Media Questionnaire is one example, but I'm delighted to see that so many museums and collecting organizations have adopted these kind of acquisition questionnaires and surveys of artists. I also think we need to be asking people outside of the artist. And one of the reasons is what Regina mentioned, that artists aren't always as aware as conservators of how their work might be liable to fragility in the future.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that I work with this all the time in terms of browser window sizes. Right now, in the last show I curated for Araya Harvey, entropy8.com, which was her website from 95-96 to 1999, has a very like kind of esoteric browser size that she wanted. It's like thin and long. It's not typically like what you would think is a 600 by 800 window. It's cute that like throughout the site, if you full screen it in any way, it reminds you that it's supposed to be this wide at the top on certain pages. But it's fun to go through the exhibition and see people sitting down, and the first thing they do is full screen it. And actually, when Araya was in town and we were giving a tour, somebody did that and she stopped them and she went on a rant about why it like was meant to be this very specific size, because she was thinking of it as a sculptural object. And then I worked with an artist who sadly passed this year, Roman Borosco, who it was exactly what John's talking about, where it's supposed to be this smaller window. And we did dictate in the documentation that if you're to buy this website because it was for sale, that it has to be shown like this. We installed it for an installation before there was an auction of the work. And I installed it on a Mac, like with it in this smaller window, and made the desktop background black. And some people asked, like, is this minimized? Is something wrong? It's like, no, it's exactly how it's meant to be shown. In both cases, the artists were alive at the time when I got to talk to them about what their intent was for these pieces. We did an interview. I always like think it's so important to involve the artist. And I agree with John that you should be asking multiple parties, their assistants, sometimes even asking viewers, like, what are their feelings about the work, curators, etc. Like, it's really important. But artist as primary source is most important to me. That's an actual term. I believe it was coined by Glenn Wharton, who was the first time-based media conservator at the MoMA, artists as primary source, like we need to take advantage of that in their lifetimes to ask them what their intent is so that we can document it. And, we've lost so many individuals over time that we never got the chance to ask those questions to.
Yeah, I was speaking recently to Samia Halabi and her Amiga 1000 work. It was so important that it was displayed on an Amiga, like the actual hardware, that she considered the actual hardware the art. And I was surprised that more recently it's been displayed on bigger and different screens like billboards. And it really surprised me that that happened. I do think she was consulted and those were her wishes, but it was certainly a surprise that an artist would say that the hardware is so important, it has to be the art.
There's a difference between somebody going, oh, I've consulted with the artist, we can do this, and actually respecting the artist's intent. Many times when a large institution or a big project and the artist getting paid and all these things, it's very exciting, happen, the artist feels like they can't say no. They don't know that they're empowered to push back on what they want because they're afraid of losing the acquisition, the exhibition, the partnership. And so I spend a lot of time educating artists on feeling empowered to push back because it's their artwork. It's really important that, if they don't feel comfortable, they really think about like the intent as to why they created the piece, like that it's not going to get shown on a billboard. Maybe in this case, it did have this type of mutability. I don't know. I didn't talk with her, but also we do see this all the time, this case of the artists made compromises that they didn't necessarily have to make.
Yeah, and I'll just add that if there is no public document, right, where you've done an interview with an artist and you have that documented in video, in written form, in the Variable Media Questionnaire, which is a public site, then you don't have a sort of will and testament that people can refer to and say, this is what the artist wanted, right? So you don't have to use the questionnaire. I mean, it's got Namjoon Paik and Corey Archangel, whatever, but there are artists who've done this themselves. Casey Reese and Raphael Lozano-Hemmer, people you've had on your program already, they've decided to share with other artists their thinking about how to preserve works. So any way that we can to sort of put that out there, sometimes I hear that people say things like, you're really sort of pushing artists to not just let their work be by asking them to kind of think through these issues and imagine all these scenarios and consider emulation and reinterpretation and migration. And my response is that, well, if you as an artist don't say, this is the way I want my work, or these are the ways in which I want my work to be preserved, someone else is making that decision for you. The best example that I can think of is Dan Flavin, the minimalist artist, also from the Panza collection, whose work was made of light. When the Guggenheim reopened in 1991 or so, there was a exhibition of Flavin's work that took up the whole rotunda. And we went back and forth about what the light bulb, the sort of wall label should say. And he said, I don't want them to say bulbs. I don't want them to say fixtures. I want them to say light. My work is light. It is not about the fixture. He died. What happened? His estate went back and started to custom wire special ballasts into the fixtures so that those could be bought and sold. So I think he's rolling over in his grave. Why? Because he didn't have the kind of testament that Regina is referring to, that we could look up publicly and say, I don't think that's what the artist intended.
However, I don't know if Flavin knew that a lot of these particular bulbs were going to become obsolete in the way they have. And he was so particular about color, like how the exact temperature. And so conservators do have to think pretty heavily and work with very specific groups in remote areas that are still going back to the technician idea of actually making the hardware components of these to the specifications that allow for the exact temperature to be what's displayed. I mean, I think I always going to see Flavin's is really crazy for conservators and curators because we're always kind of thinking about like, is this being displayed properly? Like, is this the actual light as Flavin intended? I'm always very skeptical. I don't know.
Sure. I mean, that was the case during his lifetime, right? So if we lent a Flavin to a museum in Germany as the Guggenheim in New York, we wouldn't send them a bunch of fragile bulbs. We tell them buy the bulbs that fit this standard in Germany that fit the appropriate voltage and other conditions. So that expectation was already there, and it was just at that point a kind of practical decision. I think that where I get really stuck is this idea that Flavin's Flavin was deliberately interested in off-the-shelf, easy-to-access material. When those no longer become easy to access, then the kinds of kind of custom creations you're describing, Regina, I don't have a problem with those. A conservator in Germany literally just wrapped a normal white bulb with the kind of gel that was the color of the red bulbs that were the initial problem. But it's more like when a collector gets so fixated on the material, the atoms, as opposed to the experience, that they lose the experience in the process. So I had always worried that a collector would basically say, someone come over to your house and you see a bunch of inert bulbs in the corner that aren't even lit up and say, oh, there's my Flavin. And lo and behold, someone told me an anecdote later of visiting a collector's home where they did literally that. And to me, that's an absolute travesty that no artist should allow to happen if they can avoid it.
We don't really see this as much with Born Digital art collectors, though. If they display the works at all and then don't just keep them offline forever, and then they're often displaying them in ways that are not considering artist intent at all, like with black bars, in the wrong aspect ratio and all these other issues, or, trying to confine it to a square when it's not supposed to be. And this is a whole other layer of display technology that's owned by these collectors, or even gallerists that are not helping be facilitators between the artist and the collector on why having specific display technology matters for showing the work. It's not just here, hand you a file and you can display it however you want. And that goes to also John's point earlier that artists don't often consider all the forms of display on their own. And I often feel like I break that cycle by asking artists if they're okay with it being displayed upside down. And then suddenly they really care and they know exactly how they want the work displayed. Because often they'll be like, it's okay, even if it's on a phone or if it's on a projected, to the size of the moon. But then I'll be like, but upside down? And they're like, oh, wait a second. No.
That's a great idea. At the Guggenheim, we had an interview with Namjoon Paik for variable media purposes before his retrospective. And his term he came away with was maximum decontrol. And was like, oh, wow, you could do anything. And then we went and got a bunch of pictures of a famous work of his called TV Garden, which was TV sets with plants all around. And we showed them to his entire studio crew. And they were like, oh, God, that's horrible. No, never do the Sao Paulo one. There were way too few plants. It looked awful. So when you actually show the pictures or when you ask them if the work can be upside down, you might find that they have predilections that they don't think about conceptually.
Yeah, I think those are really great messages for artists to think about these issues and for them to consider. And I'm wondering about the collector perspective, and especially from museums. Can you kind of talk about how collectors can learn from museums and how museums approach preservation, especially from your own experience? What are some of the things that collectors can take away from how museums approach digital preservation?
I'll start in a very cynical way, and then John will probably have a lot to say too. But museums still have a lot to learn, a lot to learn. Again, mentioning that I'm both a curator and a conservator, it's been a very interesting position to be in, being part of acquisition committee meetings. And a lot of the time when work enters an institution, of course it's for the historical precedence of the work and this desire to exhibit it and all these things that are outside of the technical needs and specifications. However, I've learned that often curators choose to acquire work for what ends up being emotional reasoning. It's not necessarily logical reasoning. And therefore there is a lot of work that enters collections, time-based media artwork, that has technical problematics that don't get considered in the total cost of ownership at the institutional level still. And then what happens is if you don't involve the conservators in that acquisition process early on, there's a term actually called pre-acquisition. There's a pre-acquisition report. Not all museums do pre-acquisition reports, including the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim does not do pre-acquisition, but we do because I'm holding both roles, where it's okay, if I want this work to enter a collection, I should go to the artist studio, review the work, do some of the quality assessments before we decide to actually write the acquisition proposal. That's not happening in other institutions regularly at all. So what happens is the curator will be like, huh, we got this new work, conservators, figure it out. And then the conservators are like, oh my God, my budget can't handle even ingesting this into the system and making this something that's presentable. And they're so it almost gets shelved. And then also there's such a backlog, like even institutions that have the privilege of having multiple time-based media conservators, which incredibly rare, less than 5, I feel like, have like even a full-time time-based media conservator. They are just like a singular person or just a small team. So like there's always this backlog of work that is at risk. The Whitney's another good example. I think you had Joshua Davis on for one of your podcasts, and maybe they even mentioned that like there's a work at the Whitney that's Flash-based that like at the time wasn't fixed. And this idea like, okay, institutions, their job is to exhibit work and educate on work, and however, they're not there to constantly conserve everything all the time. It has to have like a reason for being conserved, which it's like, it's a ticking time bomb to me and like causes sleepless nights, just like the idea of this. Going back a little bit and being a little less cynical, and there's way more to be cynical about. I've barely touched the surface of how institutions are not doing one. I'll say one other thing, like, I think it's important for everyone listening to understand that institutions, like time-based media conservators, all kind of know each other. There's not many of us in the world. However, on an institutional level, the standards are not the same across institutions. Like institutions, think about institutions as individuals that have particular missions and egos. And so therefore they have different metadata, like ways of approaching metadata, ways of approaching their technical questionnaires. And so they don't always like speak the same language, even though they're kind of like slightly all on the same page. And this also causes like huge problematics, not just when there's loans, but in general, like just in terms of standardization. On one front, like what can collectors learn? Collectors can learn what not to do almost from institutions in a sense. On the positive side, starting with John, who can speak more to this, and the Variable Media Initiative and the Variable Media Questionnaire at the Guggenheim in 1996, 98. No, that was 98, but 96 was
98. Very impressive.
Yeah. That's when time-based media conservation becomes a thing in 96. But the idea of these questionnaires really become a thing in 1998. Like, that's incredibly helpful to think about the mutability of work and the fact that there's obsolescence and how to take care of this. So like, that's a big part of these acquisitions. But I'll also say, again, being cynical, that like just because a work has entered an institution doesn't mean that technical questionnaire is happening right away because of backlog. So sorry, everybody. I feel so bad just not being positive about this. Yeah, that's the reality. And okay, one other thing is that a lot of these learnings have historically been wrapped up in institutions and in academia, and a lot of it isn't being shared directly with artists, galleries, and collectors. There is gatekeeping. And so I've spent basically my entire career fighting against that.
All right. I said to myself, well, I'm going to disagree with Regina about something during this podcast, because I agree with her on like 90% of everything. And I think podcasts are more interesting with this disagreement. It's really hard for me to take the like pro museum stance here, but I'll try. I think that, I echo the problems she mentioned, particularly this sort of like non-interoperability of different museum standards. Like, oh, I use this metadata to catalog a video piece. So I use this different metadata. That was the purpose of the Variable Media Questionnaire, was to put everything in one place so that we'd have a common standard. I've tried different initiatives around that front, haven't succeeded too well. But I think it's largely to do with the, kind of I'm going to make my own attitude that a lot of museums have, especially the sort of the museums on the frontier who are doing this kind of, collecting and accessing works. They often feel like, their technical staff is going to kind of invent it themselves, which is fine in principle, but if there's nothing in common with other systems, then there's no way to look up, for example, like how ZKM or LACMA or the Guggenheim all treated an Nam June Paik installation. But I will say that, one of the things that I think collectors can learn from museums is that sometimes I think of the conservator as sort of like the angel of the conscience on the shoulder of the curator, saying like, hey, hold on, we don't have all this stuff. You should really check to make sure, that the artist has specified what we need to kind of recreate this work in the future. But in a way, that sort of like that sometimes very egotistical drive of the curator to like, let's get this work and let's exhibit it and let's put it out there and let me get credit for it. That has a kind of positive side in a way, which is that it makes you exhibit the work. While there are some museums that just hoard stuff and they put things in storerooms and they don't have enough time or space in their collection to put it out there. I think there are cases where you want to show off your new acquisitions and you go to put them on the wall or on a pedestal or on the floor and they don't work. And you're like, oh crap. right? Private collectors have less space in their rooms or their houses usually to show things. But if they get in the practice of putting out recent works that they've collected, they're much more likely to encounter those conservation problems. Ideally, they would have done the, sort of pre-acquisition questionnaire, but they're more likely to encounter them while they're still in contact with the artist, and they still have a little leverage in terms of like, hey, this won't turn on. We did a show at the Guggenheim based on a whole bunch of essentially video-based works, multi-channel videos. I wasn't in charge of it, but my understanding is that when they went to exhibit it, they opened up all the crates and there were no source materials. There was no DVDs on which the source video was displayed. Why? Because at the time, conservators were used to checking objects. Oh, it's got a box, it's got a speaker, it's got a plant that goes next to it. They didn't think about that, well, it runs on some kind of digital data you need in order to drive the whole installation. You're not going to find out those problems if you don't exhibit it. The old adage of painting conservators is the best place to store a painting is on your wall in your living room, because you can see it and it's safe and no one's going to bump into it and you won't forget it. That's also true of digital works. The best way to conserve them is to put them out on display.
One other thing I wanted to add, that it's not that institutions haven't tried to standardize among each other. The Getty for a long tried to standardize controlled vocabularies and at some level metadata. There was another project that tried to bring 3 museums together to have shared standardizations, and they all ultimately failed. And I think it does come down to your institutional ego.
I love that term, institutional ego. I will also say that there is a danger in the reverse. So I'm also part of the sort of the digital preservation community as it relates to libraries and archives, these sort of collections. They have different mandates and different needs. They're typically dealing with hundreds of thousands of objects. Those objects are much more regularized. Even if it's like a video game collection at Stanford, they're still all kind of, they're all on CD and they're all playable in this way and so forth. But they tend to get together in these big, industry groups and spend years hammering out some standard that's super abstract and expects all these institutions to sort of fall in line. So for example, OAIS, the Open Archival, Information Standard is like the first thing you learn in any like digital curation class anywhere. And in my opinion, it's absolutely useless. Like it just has never been built. It's this abstract sort of formulation. It has some, useful ideas like, oh, what's the, the community that's related to, relevant to this artifact or whatever. But it depends on all these people doing technical things, which they haven't done. So as much as I would criticize museums for not, getting together and agreeing on things, they're also, again, exhibiting things. They have to put stuff on the walls because they depend on ticket sales to get people in the door and fund their institutions. So the fact that, every time there's an exhibition of a work, and I know Regina knows this really well, you're kind of like just struggling to capture all of the information required to make these things work. That's actually, it's trial by fire, but it is a really necessary sort of stage of any acquisition process, I think.
Okay, if collectors really want to understand anything from institutions, it's something called like an archival information package or a submission information package. So collectors can learn that they should be going to an artist before they acquire a work or right after they acquire a work and make a checklist essentially of everything they need for preservation purposes. Are there archival files? We have something called mezzanine files, the working files, maybe even the working files environments, like if they were using Photoshop, what version, all that kind of stuff. Having a technical questionnaire and supplemental information, like anything that's going to help them understand that preservation process, like all the documentation that goes into that. You need it for everything that you collect. You really do, even if it's just a still PNG. So I'll give it that.
A lot of the people that are probably listening to this collect work, at least partially, if not primarily, on the blockchain. And I was talking to a media artist the other day, actually about this upcoming talk about preservation, and they were kind of surprised because they just assumed that blockchain was a storage mechanism and that it was a robust storage solution. And why would we even need to be having this conversation? So I'm wondering, and I can see Regina, your face changing. I'm wondering, is that accurate to think of the blockchain as a robust storage solution, and why or why not?
No, it is not. And sigh. Where to start? I mean, it's a whole rant in itself. Blockchains, even Ethereum, which wasn't just created to transact the currency, it was also created so that you could build decentralized applications on top of it, communicate through things like Web3, JS, etc., which is mostly off-chain anyway, but it's this idea of an application layer. Still, it wasn't designed with the idea of being a storage device. We have to think about node operators to really understand this, and not just like the technical affordances of these chains in themselves. If you actually want to participate in the concept of decentralization with blockchains, you're going to want to become a node operator. You're going to want to, I'm going to keep using Ethereum as an example, like you're going to want to use Go to compile and download Ethereum like as a way to uphold that chain, to be a node in that system, right? Full node, archival node, etc., whatever. That requires, again, I think like my theme for this talk is like hardware. Like, please never like think about Born Digital anything separate from the fact that there is an incredibly like tangible material component. And so I'm setting up this apparatus in my house and all this hardware that has to run this Ethereum node. And this Ethereum node, as a validator, also carries the memory of that chain. And in carrying the memory of that chain, it's going to be multiple terabytes. And it's growing all the time because there are how many transactions per second on Ethereum? So I'm managing like upwards of up to like 10 terabytes. I don't know what we're up to now. Maybe we're even past that. It's always growing every time I do these talks. And that is a lot for an individual to no node operator wants to be managing multiple terabytes of data and constantly needing to update that software, which that's a whole other part of this is like, we talk about blockchains being immutable, but they are constantly soft forking. They're constantly updating. Like you're updating, it's software. It's software that has to be compiled and is brittle on some level. It is. And people don't like to hear that. And most people listening don't even run nodes, or they run nodes through a third party like Infura, who's still doing that, who still has warehouses of servers that are managing like all of these terabytes, redundant terabytes of data. So just talking about that, the node operators don't even want to be managing all this data. It's not simple. It's energy intensive, even though it's not the same environmental issues. It's just like, you have to have like some developer skills there. The smart contracts themselves are only a certain amount of kilobytes, a small amount, like an email holds more kilobytes and is very limited when you add an attachment than what you really should be including like on chain. And so most of these works that are applied to the blockchain or registered to a blockchain aren't even on chain or have primarily off-chain components, or there's like a mix of both. It's not acting as a good storage device. It's not a preservation tool. And again, like it's not even immutable. It is constantly changing. There's this initiative, the purge stage of the merge, the purge, etc., like that Vitalik initiated, partially because node operators don't want to be handling all of this data. This idea in the future that transaction data after it's a year old will be purged from the chain to help lessen the load for the node operators, that's going to affect certain artworks and how they run, even if they have mostly on-chain components. To kind of just like summarize this, like blockchains are software. They're software that has to compile. They're software that has to run on a hardware like apparatus as we currently understand it. Which is also going to shift and change. The chains itself were not built to hold massive amounts of storage. That wasn't the point of them. Most of this is off-chain. So I'm always shocked at how many individuals, including collectors, still don't understand this because I talk about it so much.
The only thing I might add is the misunderstanding about copyright, which for most examples is something that, again, is a huge, kind of misconception of collectors.
I mean, I'll say a little bit about it because, okay, so I also consult for collectors. I can't say who, there's one particular collector I work with who is the only collector probably in the world doing pre-acquisition reports now and like actually cares about what they collect and if they can, thinking about total cost of ownership. I'm so like happy that they exist. Like they're a beacon for other collectors. And so I know they're capable. I do these technical interviews with artists that they've already collected. We just did one yesterday. And on my questionnaire, I always ask the artist if it's okay if the collector wants to donate the work to a museum. This isn't a question that we would ever have to ask a collector who has purchased a painting or a sculpture, or even a born digital artwork that has nothing to do with the blockchain. Why we have to ask these artists for works that have an NFT related to them is that from, I guess, a legal perspective, the collector technically only owns the token, only has ownership to the token. I don't know how much this has changed and increased since the last time I've thought about it, but for now, we just want to make sure that we have it in writing and legal agreements to these collectors' archival information packages for these artists that state that the collector has the rights to display the work, to donate the work, etc.
Yeah, and that might sound weird, but remember that people people sell the rights to stars or the Brooklyn Bridge or things like that. They're sort of bragging rights. And so NFTs have been described in various metaphors, but bragging rights is one of the sort of better ones when it comes to copyright, because just because I've got a star with my name on it doesn't mean I own the star and all the planets and inhabitants there. So you have to remember that because these works are typically off-chain, there are some counterexamples. The Bored Apes, for example, I believe conveyed copyright to the owners of the NFTs, but it's in almost every case you do not own that. You own again, I haven't looked at the most recent contracts of some of these marketplaces, but you own the right to display a thumbnail essentially of the media associated with the NFT. I would also just say that as much as I like to rag on the blockchain as a preservation medium because of its cheerleaders touting it that way, every time you have a new kind of technology come along that makes something possible that we all get excited about and even seems to sort of increase access, it often ends up being a vulnerability in the long run. And that's maybe just kind of the double-edged sword, nature of these technologies. So, for example, when the internet came along, suddenly we could all access, a website, and we could view the artist's work from anywhere in the world, and we could see the code. It was right there with view source. How could that ever disappear? Well, we know now that because of changing browser standards, we have to do a lot of backflips to get back to the experience of the original. And in the case of blockchain, that's going to be another vulnerability, in my opinion, in the long run. Sometimes because of the specific software that was used that Regina mentioned, not just the chain itself, but dependencies offline and JavaScript and so forth, but also the chain itself could die if there aren't enough node operators and interest diminishes. Regina and I did a presentation at a conference last year, I guess it was, talking about different strategies for like storing, migrating, or emulating a chain that broke. Right. And even there's questions. So, again, emulation is a wonderful tool. I think it's probably the best option for blockchain-based work as well as artificial intelligence-based work, but you have options. It's not obvious what you should do. Should a chain die? Should you sort of reset it and run the chain in an emulated environment? Should you fork it? And wherever the point is, it seems like it's going to die. You keep that one going, but you create a new fork that carries on from where that left off. Or you sort of continue it and kind of ignore the history and start a new chain from zero. Those are all different choices that, maybe one artist is going to make one choice, another artist is going to make another choice. How are we going to deal with the fact that multiple artists on the same chain have different choices for how they want their work to persevere? These are really thorny questions. Just to add to the complications of a new technology comes along, it doesn't necessarily solve every preservation question.
I've created 4 categories for works as they enter institutions that involve blockchain technology. The first tier is true for 90% of artworks, where the artist had registered the work to a blockchain for financial reasons, just to make collectors happy, so that there was this NFT attached to it, that it could be sold with cryptocurrency. Although you could sell a work with cryptocurrency without registering it to a blockchain. That just rarely happens because of the way these socially works. In those cases, if a museum is interested in that work and the artist approves of such, you don't collect the NFT component at all. You just collect the born digital assets that are 100% off chain because they're otherwise not related. Then there's the second type, which is artists that have completely off-chain work that was registered to a blockchain for conceptual purposes. And so it goes a little bit beyond the just the financialization of it. Even though there's no relationship between the exhibition of the work and the chain, the artist still thinks it's an essential component. And so in that case, the museum still has to consider the NFT. Then there's partially on-chain works, which is now we're in the 10% kind of category. It's like it's like 9% of that 10% is works that have off-chain components, but also on-chain. And there's a behavioral aspect of the work that's essential. So then the museum has to think about that. And then there's the fully on-chain, which doesn't exist, by the way, but it's like leaving that category there just in case, of work that is like, say, all ASCII and in the smart contract and doesn't require a specific shape. I say this, it doesn't necessarily exactly really exist because using autoglyphs as an example, autoglyphs do not display as intended all the time just by viewing it in a smart contract. Like, it does require some understanding of the particular shape and putting it into a viewer, which the viewer doesn't even show it correctly depending on browser you're in, etc. So often autoglyphs are like upheld as this like, oh, it's like fully on chain, but no, it's really hard to find an example that really fits in that category. Yeah, so institutions should understand in most cases they may not have to collect the NFT at all or worry about the blockchain components, but I always kind of like laugh to myself that the future is nonprofits, archives, and museums being the ones with their hard forks, like managing dead chains so that the works that do involve behavioral components that necessitate the blockchain can still run. And that those institutions are going to be applying for like NEA grants and Mellon grants to upkeep that. And again, I know that collectors don't like to hear that, but that's the reality as we see like the hardware apparatus change as quantum computing as a personal computing system is like on the precipice and emerging technologies that we haven't even considered yet.
Yeah, I'd like to talk maybe a bit more about copyright, or at least how you would advise collectors to approach copyright. Is it something that they need to think about for every piece, or yeah, how exactly would you advise them to even just think about it?
Most institutions don't have copyright to artworks that they acquire. Usually the copyright does stay with the artwork. I think there's a difference though between licensing of copyright for a collector and institution and just having no say in copyright at all. For example, like I think it's important, maybe this is controversial. There's a lawyer that I really respect on this topic who hates all copyright. It's nice if say a museum or a collector acquires a piece and they still have to pay the artist, like if they want to publish an image of the work in a book. Like I just like ways to help like continue to compensate the studio and the artist, or it's great for estates too. Like estates really need that funding to uphold an artist's legacy. And so having just licensing or like not having the copyright and so that that estate can still continue to be paid for like image licensing is important. However, what collectors need is clear legal documentation that they can publicly display the artwork if they claim to have ownership over the object, which again, like is not an issue with painting or sculpture or these tangible works that are not involved with the blockchain. So the ability to display publicly is something that collectors should be asking artists for. The ability to donate to a museum, like I said, like none of that is guaranteed just off purchasing an NFT, like the token component of that.
Yeah, I would just add to that as Regina says, traditionally museums in the US have not gotten copyright when they acquire a painting or sculpture, but they do get a non-exclusive right to show it. We talk about copyright as though it's one thing, it's a bundle of different rights. One of the rights is, for example, the ability to have an object in your collection that you decide where it goes and whether it's in storage, whether it's on the wall, whether it's on loan. Obviously, that's a right that every museum would probably argue for an object in its collection. But then there's the rights to the image, which is different. As Regina mentioned, museums typically do not own the rights to the image exclusively, but they can ask for a non-exclusive right to reproduce the image. So that's very common. For example, you want to put an exhibition catalog together of your collection. You don't want to have to go to the 10,000 artists in your collection and ask each of them for the rights each time. However, there are other countries in which that is the case. For example, in Canada, to display a painting, the museum has to get confirmation from the artist or their estate and typically pay them a fee. So it varies by nation. That said, in the case of NFTs, as I mentioned, as I understand it, at least as of a year ago or so, copyright was not typically conveyed, even the rights to do more than display a thumbnail. So if you want to do more than that, as Regina says, you should definitely have that conversation.
I want to just like make a statement as well on this point about my own institution. So our institution does tend to ask for the non-exclusive like licensing to these images. And of course, all institutions like want full rights to being able to, display and store the work. However, I tell artists all the time that if an institution is saying like, congratulations, we want to do an exhibition with you and display a work, even if it's in a group show scenario, like that's not enough. In the US and in my institution, we absolutely always compensate the artists and pay them an artist fee to display their work. So maybe it's not a hard and fast rule in the US, but just because you have the rights to the work, if that artist is still living, I believe they deserve a fee.
Yeah, this is all, I think very helpful. And then one thing that we probably have to cover is just some basic strategies for the DGens, strategies for preserving blockchain-based work. And ideally, we could also talk about strategies for preserving AI-based work, as that seems to be becoming more important too. Maybe first about blockchain-based work.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, it's about, especially if the artist is living, you bought the work, good for you. Like now you need to talk to the artist about getting what would make up an archival information package or an APE. Like you do not have everything. What you probably purchased was a compressed file through a platform, and that compressed file is also not necessarily what the artist intended to even show on the web, like as an exhibition copy. It's likely that they were almost forced into compressing their file to under 100 megabytes because that platform didn't feel like paying the server fees necessary that would allow for more than caching, like the simple compressed file. So you might have nothing. Okay, so you better go back to the artist and ask them what their intent was, even for the exhibition copy or the web copy of the work. Get that proper file at the right size. It's going to be larger too. Like be prepared, collectors, that AIP, say you're collecting a video work, could be like in the 3-digit gigabyte number, and like you got to be prepared to store that and everything. And then thinking about that mutability, like please, if you are a collector who loves, say, generative art, if we're talking about like Lorandom, like you need to care about mutability, not immutability, and appreciate like the evolving of that piece. And just as a note, like, oh, now do you want to, ask the artist for the source code or like all of their working files? As I said earlier, some artists will say no, that's okay. Maybe you want to have an agreement with them that says that you only get access to that in a certain circumstance if there's an interventive conservation need. So just don't also expect all artists to yield to everything that you think you need in your archival information package. Like listen to them first. Again, like please flip the hierarchy a little bit. Like you are a vessel for the artist's legacy.
So maybe I'll take on the AI challenge since I don't claim to have expertise over it, but I'm nowhere near Regina's level of understanding and preserving the blockchain. Artists and conservators have just started to think about this. And obviously, as happened with the blockchain when it first came out, generative AI is moving extremely quickly, and it's hard to even know what we'd be preserving in 10 years based on how fast the currents are moving now. That said, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about large learning models, that these language models are somehow constantly adapting to what's around them and to us. And every time we type a prompt into ChatGPT, it's learning from our prompt. That's not the case. So what's happening is these foundational models are trained. It takes a lot of effort to build them, and then they're released periodically. So every time there is a new release that incorporates as much data that these companies like OpenAI and Microsoft and Google can pull from us. And that data does make it into the new model, but the models themselves are kind of discrete. They're sort of like, oh, this is, OpenAI Turbo 3.5, whatever. So that is actually a kind of boon for preservation, because in theory, it means you could just emulate the environment on which the model originally ran, and it would be kind of a static, piece of software like a CD-ROM or something. And the funny thing here is that I think people use a lot of metaphors for AI, especially the AI boosters. Are like, this is a super intelligence, this is like a child that's growing, this is an enthusiastic intern, all these sort of like animistic metaphors for what these things are. I think a really much better metaphor is a compression algorithm. Regina mentioned that you're likely to get a zipped file when you acquire a blockchain-based NFT. Well, in essence, ChatGPT is a big zip of the internet. It takes 300 billion tokens from the Common Crawl and all these other websites that have been scraped, and it reduces them to about 150 million weights, I think GPT-3 has, which is a huge shrinkage, many orders of magnitude smaller. In theory, it is able to reproduce, kind of the knowledge embodied in the internet by typing a prompt like, what is the capital of France? If there's a lot of data nearby, you're going to get a reasonable answer. If there isn't, you're going to get a nonsense answer. So it's not a perfect system. It's a lossy compression format. But if we think of these things as essentially, sort of zip files, then it's just a single file that you essentially run. And if you can run it in the right environment, you can recreate the results. Now, again, artists are always pushing the envelope. So they're going to tweak these systems after the fact. They're going to kind of take a car and put aftermarket parts on it. For example, with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst's project for the Whitney, it uses, I think, Stable Diffusion under the hood, but it's got this LoRa or, sort of fine tuning that they did on it so that when you type fluffy bunny into the interface, it doesn't give you a fluffy bunny, it gives you Holly Herndon as a fluffy bunny. So it's tweaked in that way. So
unless you break it, which I've done a bunch.
Did you break it?
Yeah, I don't want to give away my secrets, but if you type in certain words into the prompt in this Whitney piece, you can break it, and it won't show up as the aesthetic that you expect. That's expected by Holly. Yeah.
So those edge cases, those sort of like cases in which the large language model fails, are very important. They're very important for researchers. They're important for history. Artists have always been the ones to misuse technology to find its secret underbelly. And Regina, you're following that footsteps by messing with Artport. But my point is that in addition to the sort of foundation model, you'd have to glom on what other aspects relate to the artist's work. And again, the problem is always sort of peripherals, right? So if you think about, like Regina said, there is no such thing as a really truly on-chain work that's all on-chain that has no external dependencies, because you have to look at it. Maybe some of Ria Meyer's work, you could say, well, that's a conceptual piece. It just changes something on the chain and we never have to see it. But even there's usually a website that you can see that, kind of documents the results of your change. That transaction is visible. And in almost all generative AI, even, the most groundbreaking artists like Eric Salvaggio, who's pushing the idea of noise in generative AI, there's still something you see as a consequence. And anytime there's something visible or audible or perceivable, there's going to be a peripheral. There's going to be a display. There's going to be a resolution. There's going to be a surface that it appears on. And that means variable media. I think emulation is probably the most promising strategy right now, because basically it's a mathematical series of matrices with weights in them. That's a software file, but you're always going to have to figure out, how am I going to see this thing? And that's going to get into issues of artistic intent and bring in all the other questions that Regina mentioned this whole time.
Also, when we're talking about something like machine learning algorithms, et cetera, like, it's important to note that most time-based media conservators are working institutionally, and so they have so much on their plate around just dealing with the acquisitions that are coming down to them, and unfortunately don't tend to have time to constantly keep up with the research needed for understanding the technical implications of emergent technologies. So just as institutions are often 10 years behind, so are the conservators. Like, still one of the most exciting topics for most time-based media conservators are cathode ray tubes and CRT monitors and keeping up with PAIC, which is incredibly important and super at risk right now. However, even when I try to have conversations with colleagues about the risks of blockchain technology, and now with artists that are using machine learning algorithms, which of course I have to state, as we know, as you definitely know, Peter, is not new at all. And this has been also happening since the 60s, and it's just grown. I mean, not that there hasn't been extreme changes now with the algorithms we have in the last few years. The people who are meant to be experts are not up to date. And so the last thing I'll say on that front is that the reality is that time-based media conservators are generalists. We all have to be generalists because we're dealing with all the problematics of any kind of emergent technology, any kind of media archaeological technology. And that is more knowledge than one individual can ever hold, or even a collection of individuals. We can help advise philosophically and conceptually, and definitely do a lot of interventive conservation practices per project. But the nature of our field is that constantly keeping up with the next thing the military invents.
Well put. I would also just mention, as an aside, that John Bell, who's been a collaborator with Regina and I on some blockchain-based experiments on preservation, is probably going to work with myself and Francesco Franco, who is a conservator based in Europe, and Christiana Paul, who's been on this program, the most important curator after Regina, of course, of digital art today. But on preserving AI-based artworks. So we're at super initial stages, but we've started a conversation. I'm sure there's other groups elsewhere that are talking about it, but we'll see what strategies emerge from these conversations.
Yeah, I can't wait to learn more about that. And I'd love to talk to Christiane more as part of the series. And maybe we can properly wrap up with talking about how we can, and this is not really wrapping up, but talking about how we can sort of break down preservation into sort of component parts. And John, I know in your course at the University of Maine, you talk about storage, migration, emulation, reinterpretation. Can you maybe talk as high level as you can about some of those things and about how they apply to the time-based preservation that we've talked about so far today?
Sure. Let's take an example, right? It's easier with an example. So blockchain. A lot of your viewers are interested in blockchain-based works. To store a chain would be, essentially to run a node of the type that Regina mentioned. And she described the challenges of that. Clarify for me, Regina, there's a validator node and a mirror node, and those are not the same for Ethereum, right?
There's more than that. There's like 4 different types of nodes.
Okay,
Yeah, but
right.
I think in most cases, people are thinking about running full nodes.
So full node would be validating, and that's where you get into the terabytes. And I know that ZKM tried to run a validator, and they ran into trouble just with bandwidth, even just like the sort of processing back and forth. So there are issues with there are levels of storage, right? But if you just wanted to be a mirror node, in theory, you're just kind of copying what's the current state of the chain and participating in, essentially decentralized archiving. So that's something you could do that would fall under the category of storage, I would say. But still there, you've got a series of choices you have to make depending on for a chain that dies, say. Are you just going to let your node expire? Well, then what's the point? Are you going to sort of freeze it? So you say like, well, I'm just going to take a snapshot of the chain at that one moment. Again, that debilitates the sort of transactional nature of some of the more creative uses of the chain. Are you going to try to sustain it by, running your own validator, and you're the only node operator left in the universe runs that particular chain? So even with something like storage, there are choices that have to be made. I don't think storage is a great option. There's an obsession with storage that sort of the archivists and the librarians have that I think is really misplaced. They spend all this time doing fixity checks to make sure like a file is really the same file when you transfer it from one hard drive to another. But they sort of forget that all the software and hardware necessary to run that file don't come along with the process. And that's why you need those packages. Those are a good start that Regina mentioned. My analogy is sort of like fixity is like a seatbelt. It helps to put it on, but you're sitting in a car with a volcano about to erupt next to you. You need to drive the car and get the hell out of there. So,
also, the fixity checks, they usually use MD5 checksums institutionally, even though we've moved beyond that now, and they have their own security issues. So they're like 10 years behind.
Yeah, it's a pain. So storage, again, seatbelt. It's necessary. It's helpful. It's not the solution by itself. What else have we got? Well, we got migration. So migration for a chain would be to move from one chain to another chain. And that's tough. That's hard. Migration is always a challenge in any I can't think of an example of where there's an easy migration. You always think like, oh, I just click and I go from Mac OS, 10.6 to 10.7. And there's always like some weird thing that doesn't work anymore. And you have to go back and manually recreate. The way I think of migrating a blockchain that's failing is to literally do a paper ballot where you basically like copy over somehow all of the data and put it in a new chain. I don't know, Regina, if you've got any other ideas, but that's the only one I could think of when
they already literally did that. They did that when Ethereum moved from proof of work to proof of stake. It was years of manually copying over all the data.
And just think about how nightmarish that is and how contrary it is to what we expect from these sort of automated technologies that, we don't even need humans in the loop. Well, guess what? If you're going to migrate, you do. Emulation.
It makes sense though, because again, like if 90+% of the work that's associated with blockchain technology is off chain and is focused on third-party dependencies like Google Drive or Amazon, AWS, etc., like there's also like this lack of control over migration in many cases.
Yeah, no, migration is a pain in the butt. And the other thing about migration is that every time you do it, you have to start over. There's no sort of economies of scale or sort of learning. There's a very minimal sort of amount you learn and kind of benefit from previous migrations. Like, if you switch from oh, I used to use a BlackBerry and then I switched to Android and then I switched to iPhone. Well, you didn't, like, the switch from Android to iPhone wasn't made easier by your switch from BlackBerry to Android. It was a totally different process and like, you had to start from scratch and do it all again. The advantage of emulation as the third strategy is that once you emulate a platform at the chip level, you can basically run anything that ran on that chip. So that's why emulators are popular in preservations now. We didn't come up with hardly anything. I think I did a study of something like 85% of emulators came from games, like something like 10% came from academia and maybe 5% from preservationists. Like, we're exploiting the fact, we're jumping on this train that other people made so they could play Super Mario and old PlayStation games, whatever, on their PC, and we're using that to play accounting software or old artist websites or whatever. So that's a huge advantage emulation has. And I mentioned before, there are several options, forking and resetting and so forth, for emulating a blockchain. But there again, it's the stuff that isn't in the emulated software that's the problem. All those off-chain assets that Regina referred to that are in IPFS or often Google Drive or somewhere, and not to mention the display context where you would see it, like the monitor resolution. The last one, reinterpretation, is the most powerful, but it gives the most sort of artistic leeway. And many preservationists don't even consider it a form of preservation at all. It's essentially a sort of re-performance that tries to capture the spirit of the work as opposed to a literal kind of, original experience. It's interesting to ask what that might be for a blockchain-based work. We have many examples of performance reinterpretations where someone will set Hamlet in a chat room, or, West Side Story as a reinterpretation of Romeo and Juliet. But I'm not really sure what that would mean for blockchain, unless it was perhaps using a very different technology to achieve a similar sort of validated kind of idea. Maybe it's sort of, affixing a billboard to the Empire State Building where it indicates all the records that people have, and you can all see them and you can't touch them. So they're sort of immutable, but also transparent. I don't know. Regina, do you have any ideas about what reinterpretation would be like for a blockchain?
Yeah, I thought about it quite literally. It's like there's works that continue to mint tokens over, say, like a year span as part of a performance of the piece itself. And you could simulate that in whatever environment if the actions look the same on the front end. However, just because you can doesn't mean you should. It seems highly unethical, and that requires like a lot of conversation with the artist. And again, this is why, as close to the production period of the work, close to the time the work is deployed, like that is when you should be having a conversation with the artist about what their wishes for the future of that work are. And so if you get that documented now, the artist is okay with it simulating the idea of what may have been happening on the blockchain in the past for the piece, like, then that's okay. We also want to be then transparent. At least I would like to be transparent with the public about those differences. The simplest example is for many years when a 35 millimeter film was shown in galleries, but it was transcoded to like an H.264, like an MP4. For so long, like even at the Guggenheim, it would just say like 35 millimeter film, and I'd be like, no, I'm watching this on a projector. Obviously, like on a digital projector, you clearly transcoded, I'm watching this video. And so now that practice has luckily changed in the last decade. We do normally see on a wall text like film transferred to video, and hope, as much detail as possible. We would need to do the same thing and have the same level of transparency, or even more transparency, about it not being exactly as intended on the back end. But again, I only feel comfortable with that if it's documented by the artist, if that's okay. And that's really clearly communicated and we're on the same page about that flexibility.
I think that's absolutely true. I also just realized, I remembered an example of a reinterpreted blockchain. It's actually, instead of going into the future, which is what most reinterpretation is, imagining what this would be like once the installation, the technology has died. This is actually going to the past. Before blockchain existed, there was some precedent that Regina may know of, some researchers who posted classified ads in the New York Times and used it. There was some kind of timestamp that they included, and that was their way of sort of publishing in an immutable record this kind of chain. You can look it up. I think it was like in the 1990s or something like that. There's a really funny predecessor of blockchain that we can go back to if a solar flare or climate change wipes out all our current internet and blockchain abilities.
Wow. Yeah. So it seems like one of the main takeaways is that collectors and artists, well, first of all, just need to be thinking about this and taking it more seriously, but also they need to be in greater dialogue about this, or it's going to be an even larger challenge. And then I'm wondering if both of you just maybe very quickly could tell where people could learn more. So John, you of course have that course, so please, so much of it is available online already. And I've been shilling that course. I've been telling a lot of people about it to check it out. So if you want to say anything about it, and then Regina, could you also please tell people where they could possibly learn more about maybe more blockchain-based preservation?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just mention that the digital curation or digital preservation course is part of a digital curation graduate certificate. You take 4 courses, they're all online, and you get this, graduate thingy that should train you in the workflow associated with acquiring an object in the digital world. So whether it's born digital or you have to digitize it, you acquire it into your collection, you add metadata so it can be discovered, you put it online in a database, and then you preserve it. And so you can find out more about that by searching for digital curation at the University of Maine. I will also say we have an amazing group of students from all over the place. They're not necessarily from the art world or even the museum world. We've got people from year before last, the head of patient relations at Walter Reed Medical Center. We had the registrar of the U.S. House of Representatives in Congress. We had a woman who's the curator of the U.S. Naval Undersea Museum, where they've got like unexploded torpedoes and like films from like sea lion spies with cameras attached to their bodies. And it's a pretty interesting mix of students. So I always enjoy those conversations.
I'm working on a few related projects. One is the Transfer Data Trust that was co-founded by Claudia Nicole, who is the founder of Transfer Gallery, which is on its way to becoming a nonprofit. I'm working on a project right now with 5 artists where we're putting NAS drives and network attached storage drives in each of their studios, pairing them with a group of wonderful time-based media conservators. Each of them are helping to create AIPs for works that they're staking within this decentralized collective that right now is using Filecoin and IPFS, among other protocols, but isn't reliant on that. We really need to make it about the process in this kind of variable media initiative type way. And the great thing about that project is not only are we helping these 5 artist studios out with preventive conservation processes, but there's a front end to it that others can access this information for that we're working on. It's a grant funded project that we're in the midst of right now. We're going to make the entire project open source. So the infrastructure that we're building, hopefully within the next 2 years, will be something that others can clone and deploy for their own decentralized consortiums that are focused on preservation processes. And then I'm part of a curriculum that was started by Gray Area in San Francisco called DWeb for Creators. Our first cohort, which was an 8-week course with 40 students, is up online. So I linked that on the side as well. Anybody can access that. All the lectures that we did, I sometimes go into depth about preservation, but it's also education on the history of the decentralized web beyond blockchain. There's a lot of decentralization that has nothing to do with blockchain that I think would be helpful for others to understand. We're doing another cohort next year, and you're all welcome to sign up for that class, which again will include some preservation teachings. And I'm actually writing a syllabus and course right now to be taught at a university in 2026 on the topic of preventive conservation protocols for artists. So it's specifically geared towards BFA and MFA students. Very excited about this and hope that in the future, the idea of teaching preventive documentation to artists becomes a pedagogical standard. And so I'll leave it there.
Well, I wish I had a time machine to go back and be a student in Regina's classes. Do you take old curators?
Absolutely. Well, you would be a guest, and you're obviously a huge inspiration to all of the work that I'm doing and for many of us time-based media conservators. So, of course. I talk about the Variable Media Initiative constantly to even my current students, and it's not even a preservation class.
Come on, we promised we weren't going to compliment each other, or I would have spent 10 minutes talking about you, Regina.
Yeah, I mean, John, essentially to the conservation field, at least in my mind, invented time-based media conservation. So, as I said, like Rhizome started in 1996, 2 years before the Variable Media Initiative. And so did the Electronic Media Group out of the American Institute of Conservation in 1996. But the idea of the technical questionnaire, like what's come out of that, really started with John.
There's a lot of really important people who have been there alongside me in the trenches. And it's great to see people like Regina really going far past us in figuring out not just sort of theories on how to make these things work, but actually working directly with artists and creating new initiatives like the ones she just described. It makes me hopeful for the future.
But John
Yeah.
is leading the way on the AI stuff right now. Like all the publications coming out, I haven't even had a chance to wrap my head around all of them. So it's not like you're not busy doing the good work.
No, I mean, you're both incredible, and I need to be a student in both of those courses. And this has been incredibly rich and dense, and also just went by very quickly. I've learned a lot. I think anybody listening also has, and so I really can't express enough of my gratitude. And yeah, just thank you both so much for your time. It was really valuable. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. Take care, and yeah, let's be in touch.